Yeah, let me close my tabs. I also have like 25 tabs open.
Yeah, I recently, yesterday I discovered that I had 3 windows that I didn't know about open.
Yeah.
Because I've given some talk at some point and just like hidden them away. And that I was like, oh, let me just clean up my tabs. There are only like 5, there are only like 25 of them. And I was like, oh no, there are 100 tabs open.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I think it's a form of comfort, even though like it's all available in history, right? Like you should ideally be able to access it, but it's all good.
I really, really don't trust the history. I feel like it
Why?
well, because I very often experience that I know that I went to some website 3 hours or 3 hours ish ago and I closed it. But now it's no longer in my history, and even if I search through my history, I don't find it.
Okay. Do you not like, that shouldn't be happening. You're right, that's very strange.
I never delete my history simply because I'm like, you know what, maybe I'll need that random
tab. This is the opposite. I'm surprised you're saying that as a privacy person. I don't keep like my history for YouTube. Like I audit, like I don't even keep my search history for like a lot of platforms like Twitter or YouTube. Like I'll just automatically delete it because I'm just like, I don't know. I don't want YouTube recommending me, because I looked up like popsicles one day. I don't want YouTube recommending me like some white supremacist thing. So I like completely wipe my history. So my recommendations are like almost always directly correlated with like trending or like the last like couple things I clicked, like just because it's like that fully scrubbed. But yeah, it's incredibly inefficient. Like if I forget something or if I try to retrieve something, like it's way harder and it's kind of like not worth it. But I'm surprised to hear you're like keeping all your data, giving all your data to Google so that you can review it later.
Oh no, I mean Google doesn't get any of my data.
Okay.
They're ever so kindly asked and blocked at every single turn that I can. So every time I go to YouTube or any Google site, I have to like specifically allow JavaScript from Google. And it becomes really, really annoying when websites use Google shit to like further registration or further login.
Yeah.
Where like, okay, apparently I'm allowing Google into my browser again now.
Wow.
Hey Jeff from Google, who just popped up.
Hey Jeff, I'm here too, so I can also be like anti-Google with you guys.
No, it's just about data sharing, we're only talking about data sharing.
Yeah.
My timing must have been impeccable. I don't know.
It really was.
I was gonna say, should I get started or?
Yeah. Okay, so Ida is the one who's running this session. So if you want to pop up, Ida.
Yes, hi.
Hello.
So it's my pleasure to introduce our third keynote speaker, Deborah Raji. She's a PhD student at Fundamental Machine Learning Research Group at University of California, Berkeley. She's also a Mozilla Fellow, works closely with the Algorithmic Justice League initiative to highlight the harm caused by the deployed AI products. She has also worked with Google's ethical AI team and been a research fellow at the Partnership on AI and AI Now Institute at New York University, working on various projects to operationalize ethical consideration in ML engineering practices. Recently, she was named in a Forbes 30 Under 30 and MIT Tech Review 35 Under 35 Innovator. So I welcome you, and yeah, please go ahead.
All right, awesome. Thank you. Hi, I'm Deb, and today I'm going to be talking about this sort of challenge of audits, engineering responsibility, and algorithmic accountability. And I'm going to try to connect it to the content moderation space. A lot of my examples of the work we've done is from facial recognition, but I'm going to try to make it a bit more relevant to this audience and just pull in some examples from this sort of domain of content moderation. And this is work that I did with AJL, the Algorithmic Justice League, and Mozilla. So I'm going to start with sort of this beautiful photo here. Some of you guys might recognize it. This is the Quebec Bridge. It's the longest cantilever bridge in the world. But it's also, unfortunately, the site of one of the most tragic engineering failures in the world. This bridge, during its construction, collapsed on August 29th, 1907. And with its collapse, actually, 75 of the 86 construction workers that had reported for duty that morning also perished. And in the sort of fallout of this sort of tragedy, Theodore Cooper, the lead engineer on the project, was named quite explicitly as one of the main causes for the collapse, which was a really interesting phenomenon. And he was sort of called out explicitly as being careless about his obligation as the lead engineer to not, he was sort of called out for not paying attention to safety protocols, for executing miscalculations and not being attentive in his design processes. And it was really one of like several landmark cases of this concept of engineering responsibility, where it was very clear that those that construct engineering artifacts have responsibilities or obligations to build those artifacts in a way that doesn't hurt people and that executes its purpose without causing harm. Another really sort of canonical example outside of the Quebec Bridge is that of this beautiful sports car here, the Chevrolet Couvert from the 1960s. So Ralph Nader, who's a pretty well-known consumer protection advocate and journalist, he talks about how the Chevrolet Couvert is sort of this very shoddily built car. It doesn't have a very adequate steering mechanisms, and that led to a lot of crashes that were completely preventable. And he talks about how the automobile industry, because of its lack of regulation, and in addition to other reasons and proper testing procedures, was putting out these cars that were really dangerous. And he again connects these issues with that concept of engineering responsibility, of the fact that those that build these systems that are consequential and impactful in people's lives have an obligation to think about how those built systems can cause harm. And we kind of see this theme showing up in this sort of age of AI or machine learning, and a lot of these machine learning or algorithmic tools. So one example of this is the Midas unemployment system, which was the state of Michigan's algorithm used to flag fraud cases. And that upon closer inspection or through a bunch of litigation in the courts, it was revealed that the Midas system was based on missing and corrupt data due to a very poorly managed migration from a legacy database. In addition, the whole sort of framing of the task for the Midas system was completely questionable. And as a result of that, over 30,000 cases were falsely flagged as fraudulent because of the sort of shoddy construction of this clearly ineffective algorithm. Another example of where that connection to engineering responsibility was made really explicit was with Uber ATG's self-driving car crash, where the NTSB, which is sort of the National Transportation and Safety Board, they actually name the lack of safety culture at Uber and the lack of safety features implemented through Uber's design process as one of the causes for the crash. So they talk about how there wasn't adequate testing, and they talk about the lack of features to keep test drivers alert. And they kind of tie that again to this concept of engineering responsibility or the lack thereof. Again, this is something that shows up in the medical era kind of very frequently as well. So here's an example of from 2012 of an algorithm that was used in Idaho in order to assign coverage for medical insurance. And the ACLU ended up litigating the use of this algorithm. And through the litigation process in court, when they kind of audited the tool as part of that process, that legal process, they found that the tool was based off of deeply flawed data. And they actually had to completely throw away most of the data that was feeding into the system. And there's sort of this great quote where the legal director mentions that the algorithm was making, the whole process of making the algorithm had everything going wrong at every step of the process. So it's kind of it reveals the lack of care that we put into the development of some of these very consequential algorithms. In this case, algorithms that are determining the care that can, dictates whether someone, gets to live longer or not. So again, a really surprising lack of attention being paid to the responsibilities of those building these systems, even in very consequential scenarios. And I think there's this great quote from, this is a quote from Avery Smith, who was a Black dermatologist that conducted a study identifying that AI-driven dermatology tools were not very effective on darker skinned patients. And when he sort of asked about it in an interview, the interviewer is trying to frame the whole thing as a bias issue. And he corrects him and he says, well, part of the problem is that people are in such a rush. People see the potential of these tools and they go full steam ahead without really thinking about the potential clinical consequences. And he sort of frames it as, well, people are really going after the most accessible or easy data sets to acquire, and they're not reflecting on, how it's non-representative or how it's inherently biased. So people are, in other words, he ties it to this question of people not being thoughtful or careful and cautious in their development of these systems. And as a result, that causing harm and that leading to some of the other issues we talk about, like bias. And in the content moderation space, we've seen examples of this kind of happening, these very preventable failures or these very sort of innocuous failures. So, one example is with TikTok, where TikTok was sort of being called out in a very viral fashion about how it would censor phrases like Black Lives Matter in descriptions. And their excuse for that was that their hate speech detector would sort of be looking at the word die in the word audience, and then matching that with the concept of Black, and then using that to sort of filter out and censor that content, and pretty much just revealing the lack of testing and the lack of attention being paid to what ended up being a very consequential tool. In this case, you can see there's sort of screenshots of someone attempting to sort of demonstrate this issue by writing a description on their platform. And you can see when they write supporting Black Lives Matter or supporting Black people, their content is flagged for removal. But when they write supporting white supremacy, for example, they're allowed to kind of go on. So it led to genuine censorship of Black content. Similar phenomenon was sort of viewed for YouTube and YouTube's blacklist for advertisers, where they wouldn't allow advertisers on content, sort of stating targeting videos with the term of Black power or Black Lives Matter. Meanwhile, concepts like white power or white lives matter were whitelisted. Again, just demonstrating the lack of attention to detail for something that is actually a very consequential technology. And these harms are not necessarily always bias related. I know the community likes to talk about bias a lot, but some of the consequences of sort of the lack of attention to detail and the sort of unawareness of our responsibilities that we have in this field lead to other types of harms as well. In the settlement with Facebook moderators that claim to sort of develop mental health issues as part of their work, they talk about the sort of rushed process to integrate or to establish their moderation procedures and how that contributed to a lot of their stress and a lot of the lack of support that they experience. So a lot of labor issues arise when things are sort of quickly built and quickly built poorly. Also, Facebook activity, a Facebook project on identifying individuals with mental health issues has also been criticized for being deployed before considering the privacy and sort of consent issues associated with that. So when things are sort of built quickly and poorly, other types of harms arise beyond the bias harm. And at this point, I think every week we sort of see another algorithmic failure in the news, and we see all of these headlines. And I think there's been a lot of conversations about this in terms of bias. But when I see these headlines, what I really see is something like this too, where some of these are actual just genuine failures, where these systems are crashing in unpredictable ways, in ways that we should have anticipated but didn't really think about or test for, and unfortunately in ways that will hurt people, similar to a car crash. And ideally, what we want is a situation where those that are that contributed to that car crash are held accountable in some way. So Waranga sort of writes about algorithmic accountability as an extension of this philosophical concept of accountability. She talks about the idea of different stakeholders playing this actor role where they can influence the outcome of the algorithm. And as a result of that, they have certain responsibilities where they're obligated to sort of provide the information required for those impacted or the forum to be able to judge their decision-making and have that judgment lead to consequences. But there's so many possibilities, especially with AI development, of who the actor could be or who that forum could be. And there's so many involved stakeholders. So who exactly is responsible? Several of the stakeholders can determine a model's capacity to do harm. If we want different outcomes, who needs to take action and who needs to face consequences? And today I'm going to talk about when those that build the algorithm need to be responsible, and when the actor is really those engineering the system. So that's what I'm going to focus on today, is that engineering responsibility aspect. To go back to that analogy of a car crash, think of it as like the manufacturer of the car not having any brakes in the car, or not setting up a steering system that's effective. That's really what this challenge of engineering responsibility is those that built the algorithm, did they do that in a way that caused harm? But there's also other challenges, and I'm not going to talk about it today. I'm just going to mention it. There's also this issue of operator accountability. You can have the actor be those that make use of the algorithm. So think about it in the car analogy as a drunk driver or a reckless driver, or perhaps a very kind of new, inexperienced driver that as a result of their mistakes, you have the car crash happen. And there's ways to think through what their accountability is and their responsibilities are as an operator. And then independent of that, you also have the challenge of sort of structural harms, where historical legacies and norms of society at large can cause a lot of issues. To go back to the car analogy, this would be like if there wasn't a paved road, or if there were a bunch of potholes, or if there weren't guidance like lamps or lights along the road, and that causing the car crash. So that can also be sort of a contributing factor for the harms that we observe happening to the forum or to those that are impacted. So today I'm going to focus on engineering responsibility, which is really this challenge of saying, how do we hold those building the technological artifacts accountable for the ways in which it might hurt people. So we're not going to think about the other challenges today, but focus on this issue of, well, there are people that have built the car, the manufacturers of these cars, what are their responsibilities, and how do we hold them to account for the mistakes that they make and how it hurts people? So one thing we can do to sort of address this challenge is we can audit these systems, and if they fail the audit, then we know that they didn't fulfill their responsibilities. So there's sort of two streams or two main genres of audit. One is the internal audit, and this is really the teams within the big tech companies at IBM or Google or Microsoft, the responsible innovation teams or the ethical AI teams. But it's also consultants like Accenture or Orca that have a contractual relationship with the affected companies, and sort of just have access through that contractual relationship. So they have direct access to the system and to the engineering teams. They can analyze things pre-deployment, and they often do. And then it's also, they're sort of, they have that contractual relationship. So they're employees or they're contractors or they're consultants, and they have a focus on compliance or quality control. Meanwhile, external auditors are regulators or government auditors. They're academics, they're investigative journalists, or they're advocates, and they're on the outside, so they do not have direct access. They're usually looking at things post-deployment, and they sort of execute things independently of any interests of the company. So they're focused on protecting those that they represent. Oops. So the idea of an external audit is something that is really sort of well established. It's something that we've sort of seen for a very long time. In the facial recognition space, it's been going on for over a decade. This idea of auditing a system from the outside. Oops. Okay. But then we kind of noticed these like 4 recurring issues with an external audit. So for one thing, with external audits, there's this issue of benchmark bias, where the test sets involved in assessing a system from the outside sometimes doesn't always reflect the community that you want to evaluate the system for. So you have to address that. There's also this issue of accessing the target. You're on the outside. It's very difficult to directly access, the feature or the product that you want to look at. Also, these systems are often pretty complex. So how do you isolate the target that you want to look at, the model that you want to particularly audit for? There's also this challenge of public pressure. Just because you do an audit doesn't necessarily mean people will pay attention to that audit or care. And then finally, this issue of hostile corporate reactions, where once you audit a system, companies get very upset, they can sue, and that can become pretty dangerous. So the question we asked pretty much coming into this was, how can external algorithmic audits be designed to address these challenges and lead corporations to mitigate concerns? So with the benchmark bias issue, we got some inspiration from anti-discrimination law, and we thought about this idea of intersectionality and articulating populations with intention and crafting a benchmark to reflect the populations that we were most worried about and the intersections of the identities we were most worried about. We learned a lot from the HCI space about how to design audits to isolate and access particular targets. We learned a lot from financial audits about publicly naming multiple targets to sort of build a competitive dynamic that ended up being really effective at garnering public attention. And then we learned from the information security space, where once they identify a bug or a security vulnerability, they have a very cool sort of established procedure to communicate that issue to the public and to the companies in a way that minimizes hostile corporate reactions. So we learned a lot from them about how to deal with that issue. So Gender Shades was really an attempt to take all of these learnings and try to integrate it into the design of an audit that would be effective in communicating performance on the facial analysis task of binary gender classification for these different subgroups that we cared about. And the first thing we did was we built this pilot parliaments benchmark, and Joy did a lot of work to really make sure that this benchmark was balanced with respect to male and female representation and darker and lighter skin representation. And if you look at how PPB compares to other data sets, you can see that PPB is much more balanced with respect to that representation of darker, lighter, and male, female. And what that led to is an ability to properly evaluate the performance of these systems with respect to these different populations. And you can see here that it was revealed that these deployed commercial facial recognition systems were performing much worse for darker female subjects than for lighter male subjects, for example. And following the study, the companies were really embarrassed, and they all released different levels of PR statements talking about how they were going to make improvements and things were going to be different. So then a year later, we re-audited them. In 2018, we audited them again, and you can see following the Gender Shades audit, the companies actually did change their behavior. They re-released API versions that drastically updated their performance for the darker female subgroup specifically. You can see they're doing a lot better for that subgroup. Here's Face++ between 2017 and 2018. They go from 65% accuracy to about 95%. And a similar thing for IBM. And really what that follow-up study revealed was a rebuttal to this kind of statement we were receiving, where following Gender Shades, people would say some things like, oh, perhaps it's a functional limitation that these systems can't work for people of color. Perhaps it's possible that you can't really take a good picture of a person of color, or there's something about their language that's more difficult to parse. But the reality of it is that once we audited these systems and we called them out explicitly, within 7 months, they were able to release new API versions that addressed the performance issues for the darker female subgroup, revealing that it wasn't really this like foundational limitation of function. It was actually more tied to the engineering culture and the ways that they were evaluating these systems and the ways that they were developing these systems. And it was a really interesting insight to see that, oh, this is actually an engineering responsibility issue and not necessarily this like functional limitation that prevented these systems from operating well on this subgroup. And to sort of hit that point home, we audited companies that had not previously been audited. So in 2018, we audited Amazon and Kairos, and we saw that these systems continued to have huge disparities in performance between darker female and lighter male. Even though they were in the same industry with the same product, they hadn't been called out explicitly, so they were not impacted by that initial audit. And thus their engineering practices and the engineering norms of the field hadn't really changed yet. Similarly, the National Institute of Standards and Technology kind of reproduced our results, and they also kind of went further and evaluated the performance of facial recognition systems for face identification and verification tasks. And they saw that Asian and African American people were up to 100 times more likely to be misidentified by white men. So it's very clearly an industry-wide issue. Furthermore, some people did some pilot audits where they took these tools and they went out into the world and tried to evaluate these systems. And what they found was that these systems did not work well at all once released out into the world. Most remarkably, the Metropolitan Police in the UK had acquired a facial recognition tool to assess suspects on the field, and Big Brother Watch UK, which is an advocacy group, bought that same facial recognition system to test it in deployment, and they found that it had an 81% error rate, which is excruciatingly high. So these systems do not work very well once you actually begin to evaluate them within their context of deployment. But unfortunately, one of the challenges here is, as an external auditor, you're sort of reliant on the cooperation, subconscious even, of the company that's being audited. So Kairos, once they realized that they were a potential audit target, put up this huge paywall where like the minimum you can pay to access their system is $99 a month. And once you start clicking through to make that payment, there's a bunch of clauses in there about not auditing their system, which was really alarming to see. And it's sort of part of this broader issue of sort of the legal right to access these systems in order to audit them. Sandvig versus Barr was a really critical case where Christian Sandvig, who is an HCI algorithmic auditing scholar, was able to sort of push back against potential litigation under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act that would sort of accuse him of sort of hacking these systems if he was to breach terms of service in order to audit an online tool. So it was a really big step forward in terms of just legal protection for those trying to access these systems. Similarly, Julia Angwin, who is from the Markup, and she does a lot of audits for her investigative journalism work, talks again about this idea of anti-hacking laws getting in the way of auditors' ability to really access these systems and audit them. Another sort of like limitation of the external audit is corporate responses. So companies don't always react the way you expect them to. In response to our audit work, IBM built this data set called Diversity in Faces, where their reaction to failing to perform on a particular subgroup was, well, let's just build a bigger data set of more diverse faces so we can do better. Unfortunately, they got some pushback for that because of the fact that they had sourced those faces from Flickr without much consent. So it was clear that even though they sort of were attempting to diversify the data, they weren't really adhering to people's ethical expectations of how they did that. Similarly, our audit of Face++ led a similar company, CloudWalk, to purchase face data from the Zimbabwe government in an attempt to diversify the data sets that they were using. So these issues of exploitation and a lack of consent and privacy are things to watch out for, and definitely came out when these companies sort of responded in ways we didn't expect or didn't appreciate with respect to the audit. The other sort of challenge with an audit an external audit is the idea of scope. So, when you audit a system from the outside, you can only really target a very specific demographic group, a very specific prediction task and company. When we re-audit systems that we've audited before, they have a much smaller disparity in terms of their performance on the task that we audited them previously for. So the gender classification task, for example, companies that we haven't audited before, like Clarify, continue to have that disparity. So it's clear it's still an industry-wide issue. But even if you look at another task like age classification, the companies that we had previously audited for gender classification might still have performance disparities for age classification. And similarly, if we look at performance disparities according to age rather than gender and skin type intersections, you'll see that there might still be disparities. So the scope of impact of an audit is actually quite narrow, and that can be really difficult to manage. The other challenge with an external audit is that you can't really audit pseudoscientific algorithmic objectives. So, it doesn't make sense to audit a system that is claiming to predict criminality from the face, or affect from the face, or character or personality from the face, or sexuality. That whole the whole premise of the tool is nonsensical and pseudoscientific. So it doesn't make sense to even talk about accuracy or performance. And that's like a limitation of what an audit can give you. So outside of an external audit, what else can we do? Well, we can also have this idea of an internal audit, or auditing from the inside. And the sort of language of an internal audit comes from this idea of the 3 lines of defense that's very popular in financial audit, in the financial audit world in particular. But it's this idea that, independent of the engineering management processes, or quality control, or security, or legal, you have this sort of either internal auditor as an individual, or internal audit team that has this oversight capacity where they can actually look over the entire system and assess and map out how well the entire company or the entire team is doing with respect to external or internal expectations. And the way that this has been approached in the machine learning field so far has been through documentation. That's been like the main strategy. And first we saw a lot of these data documentation proposals, so data sheets, NLP data statements, data licenses. But I think, most interestingly, we also saw this idea of model cards and communicating about the details of the model at a very high level in order to ensure some level of due diligence and engineering responsibility with respect to recording the engineering decisions being made about the model, and ensuring that a minimum amount of testing has been done about the model. So you can see, the model card really capturing a lot of that obligation. And here you can see that in addition to sort of the basic building blocks of these documentation proposals, there's a whole other sort of set of potential documents we can adopt from the internal audit cultures of the medical space, the aerospace industry, and the financial industry, the financial auditing industry, where there's all of these potential opportunities to sort of expand our internal audit practice in various ways. And I can't get into this in this talk, unfortunately, because of time, but you can kind of piece all of those documents together and come up with a very sort of robust internal audit, end-to-end sort of internal audit plan, where you can really look at all the different aspects of the engineering decisions being made about a system and record those in order to hold different stakeholders to account with respect to external and internal expectations. But unfortunately, the challenge or the limitation of an internal audit is that you can only say so much as an internal auditor contractually tied to this audit target before you get some level of pushback. So we saw that with Tim Nickerbrew and Meg Mitchell and the ethical AI team at Google, where once the critique reached a level that the company did not approve of, as employees of that company, they were just, there's this potential of them just getting kicked out, which is, such an unfortunate limitation of what an internal auditor can kind of achieve. And in this sort of, in this content moderation space, things are very interesting, where the sort of external audits that I could identify was, this work by Amnesty, where they were trying to externally assess the quality of Twitter's moderation tools. And they sort of did this qualitative study or qualitative audit where they surveyed 4,000 women, and they asked them about the effectiveness of Twitter's social media policies and response to their experience with toxicity on the platform, which was sort of an interesting outsider's view of what's going on there. Interestingly enough, one of the first model cards at Google was from a content moderation product team, the Perspective API team. So there's this, this model card, I think, is a great example of an internal audit execution for a content moderation product, where they were looking at evaluating the trigger of particular identity words for their toxicity classifier. And they were able to iterate on that classifier until they were able to minimize the trigger of those words for their toxicity score. So that's like a great example of what you can achieve with an internal audit tool like model cards. Unfortunately, in the content moderation space as well, there has been similar sort of challenges or pushback where, I'm sure people might have seen this story of Facebook disabling access to NYU researchers that were doing, they were sort of using plugin tools as an external audit strategy for Facebook's political ad targeting. And Facebook just kind of gave them a cease and desist letter and pushed back against their use, claiming privacy concerns, effectively just shutting down their entire project. So that is an example of sort of the challenges with the audit strategy as a whole. So outside of auditing, what else can happen? What else can we do if we can't necessarily, if we don't have clear avenues to execute on an audit? Well, we can also regulate these systems in order to hold those building the systems in ways that are harmful accountable for their lack of care or their failures to address issues that cause harm. So regulation is actually something that after every audit, we'll get like a couple blog posts from Amazon or Microsoft saying that they want regulation. And their reasoning around it is that, oh, well, we don't want to be singled out in these audits. It's better for the entire industry to be regulated through legislation. And with the facial recognition situation that did happen, we saw, the summer of 2019, there were over 20 new statewide and national proposals and bills on facial recognition. There were quite a few municipal bans that had been executed on facial recognition. And it was really cool to see just, how much people, kind of policymakers in particular, took an interest in regulating that industry and saying, well, if you're not going to adhere to, our expectations around engineering responsibility and your obligations to build these tools with due diligence, we're going to have regulation around, passing particular standards or restricting the use of the technology in particular high stakes scenarios where we don't trust the technology to be used. The challenge with regulation, though, is that there are lobbyists everywhere. So for every facial recognition bill in Congress right now, there's at least 2 or 3 Amazon lobbyists. There's also this issue of the fact that these companies are, very closely tied to these politicians in a way that's a bit difficult to navigate. So that definitely makes things really difficult, and it causes them to have an upper hand in shaping that policy. And we were seeing a similar thing with content moderation, where with the Digital Services Act in the EU and the Online Harms Bill in the UK, we have these regulatory proposals that are trying to enforce some level of standards and safety procedures, kind of enforcing some accountability measures on these companies that are building these systems for content moderation and holding them accountable through regulation. However, they're facing the same challenges, as we did with facial recognition. They're facing lobbyists that are incredibly and increasingly influential. And they're facing sort of the influence of these companies in terms of shaping the narrative. The case of the online safety bill, people framing it as part of this culture war, and really tying it to political objectives that distract from the main reason that these bills were introduced in the first place. So if we can't audit and we can't regulate, what else can we do? What's a third option? So another option is this idea of a recall. So a recall is really this process of saying, okay, well, we don't think the system is working. It's defective or it's unsafe for at least a subset of these consumers. So we're going to ban the system, or we're just going to make sure that there's an option for self-return. And a recall can be voluntary or mandated, but it pretty much just means that if your system is dysfunctional or really unsafe, it does not deserve to be on the market. And this kind of falls under some of the sort of consumer protection agencies. If you want to think of like the Consumer Product Safety Commission in the US, this is sort of in their wheelhouse. And this actually happened with facial recognition. So June 2020, we had IBM, Amazon, and Microsoft, due to a lot of the public pressure happening with the George Floyd protests, push back hardcore on the use of facial recognition, especially by police. And these three companies dropped the product from sale to police, dropped the product and stopped selling it to police. And you could see IBM especially just kind of completely pull out of the market and do this voluntary recall for these products. But the challenge here is that it took about like 2 years. It's a very long fight. It took about 2 years from Amazon to go from complete refusal and resistance of the results that we had shown with respect to the audit and the critique that they were facing. It took about 2 years of advocacy to go from that to them considering, a 1-year moratorium. Granted, that moratorium was this sort of first step, and since then it's been indefinitely extended. But in general, it is a very long fight to actually get a company to be convinced or to feel pressured enough to actually voluntarily take on a recall, to take their own product off the market because of concerns raised about that product. And the other issue about a recall, or the strategy of getting these companies to voluntarily remove their product from the market, is that there's a lot of loopholes. So Amazon, in their statement around the 1-year moratorium, they were very careful to talk about facial recognition, the recognition tool that they were selling. It's the sort of the recognition product, which is their facial recognition model, kind of independently sold through their API. And at the same time, they're still kind of continuing. They have another product, which is like sort of the smart doorbell Ring product, which has like surveillance capabilities. And that Ring product, through that product, they were able to partner with about 400 police forces. And that product has this surveillance capacity where it takes footage of your front porch, and they actually have a feature that they're hoping to implement where they integrate facial recognition in there. So yeah, that's kind of a way to circumvent the requirements of their own self-enforced moratorium. So yeah, many loopholes involved in a voluntary recall. So we definitely can't depend on it as a long-term solution. That being said, there's been a couple interesting wins through this mechanism, or this approach of just pressuring these companies to take the defective and harmful products off the market. You can see Stanford Medicine medical students, especially residents, once there was an algorithm that was deployed that sort of shortchanged the interns and prioritized more senior staff members. There was a lot of protests, and that led to the university just completely pulling this algorithm, out of the equation, removing it completely, and just setting up a vaccine clinic and just taking allowing a first come first serve basis and appointments to happen in order to get everyone vaccinated. So yeah, it effectively it works, and it's worked already in this particular situation. And same here as well. once there was an algorithm that determined the grades of British students, given that they were in the COVID era, not given the opportunity to sit in on their exams, and algorithm sort of adjusted their grades, and the students protested to the degree that the UK government was like, okay, we're going to just take this product out. And I think the one time we've seen this, or the time I'm aware of in the content moderation space of this recall strategy happening, is with the Twitter photo cropping tool. So, there was this crisis of the fact that, Twitter would be auto cropping, to prioritize white faces and male faces and the male gaze. And Twitter actually has this really interesting paper where they talk through, they kind of do this internal audit work where they talk through all the concerns, they evaluate everything, they find that all the claims about and the complaints are justified, and then they decide, okay, well, we're going to voluntarily recall this product, we're going to take it off of the market, or we're just going to remove this feature in this case from our product. And that was sort of an interesting example to me of sort of this voluntary recall phenomenon. So yeah, some things to consider or to remember from what I've been talking about is that, a lot of these issues that we discuss as, bias issues and fairness issues are really tied to the foundational expectations of what we should have for this technology. If machine learning is not working for a particular underrepresented group, it reveals a lot about how we develop and evaluate these systems without any concern or without prioritizing the well-being of those groups. And what it really means is that if we're not making systems that work for those groups, we're not making systems that work at all. And this is really truly tied to the basic functionality of what it means to have a system be suitable for deployment in the first place. And also, more importantly, decision-making actors have an obligation or a responsibility to minimize algorithmic harms and be held accountable. Those that construct these systems and engineer these systems do have responsibilities that we need to start holding them accountable for. So to go back to the Quebec Bridge story from earlier on, one of the saddest, facts about this incident was that when 75 individuals that collapsed in that bridge, 55 Mohawk Indians from a local reserve. Such a tragedy for the country, but it was an even bigger tragedy for that community. And they were already, highly disadvantaged in society at that point. So such a blow for that community. But that's usually how it happens, and that's what we're seeing today with respect to these algorithmic collapses. When these systems collapse, the people that get hurt are women, young people, elderly people, people with disabilities, people of color, low-income individuals. Like those are really, the fatalities of the car crash, or the collateral in some of these shoddy constructions. So when we were building these things and we're prematurely deploying them, these are the people that were hurting. Very real people. So it kind of reminds us that there's an urgency to this work because there's a lot of people currently really being impacted by all of this. And it reminds me too of this essay that I read where Ali Al-Khatib talks about this idea of, really thinking about designing systems or solutions that actually positively change the situation of those that are impacted. We exclude these communities from the dialogue of the solutions that we think we're building for them, because we kind of assume that we know better than those that we're building for. And this ties very closely to a report that literally came out yesterday or 2 days ago from the Brennan Center for Justice, where they talk about the fact that a lot of social media content moderation tools over scrutinizing marginalized communities who are the ones that they should be serving. You have, for example, Muslim Americans are subject to a lot of Islamophobia online, and a lot of the hate policies of these major tech companies will over scrutinize Muslim American or the Muslim community in a way that they don't for those that are targeting that community, the white supremacists that might be targeting that community. So it's really interesting to reflect on how effective are the tools being built here, and are they actually making the lives of those that are currently experiencing the most harassment online easier versus harder. And here's just a bunch of really great organizations representing different groups that we need to engage more with, and we need to pull in and as active participants in the process of evaluating the quality of the interventions being designed, but also really reflecting on the effectiveness of these tools for those communities. Thank you.